The state of Texas has long been known for its tough stance on crime, and while many think first of its death row, there are criminals whose acts were so calculated, so disturbing, that they now spend every remaining day of their lives behind bars with no possibility of parole. These are the stories of 3 individuals whose crimes shook communities to their core and whose sentences ensure they will never again walk as free citizens. Hit that like button and subscribe to be part of our growing community. Also, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from as we dive into this chilling story. Number 1. The case of Yolanda Saldívar. On the morning of March 31, 1995, the music world would lose one of its brightest stars in the most unexpected and tragic way imaginable. 23-year-old Selena Quintanilla-Pérez, known simply as Selena to millions of fans, arrived at a Days Inn motel in Corpus Christi, Texas. She was there to meet with someone she had trusted implicitly, someone she had considered not just an employee but a friend. That person was 34-year-old Yolanda Saldívar, and within minutes of their meeting, Selena would be fatally wounded. Selena had already achieved what many artists spend lifetimes pursuing. Born in Lake Jackson, Texas, she had grown up performing with her family's band, Selena y Los Dinos. Her father Abraham had recognized her extraordinary talent early, and by her early 20s, she had become the undisputed queen of Tejano music. She had won a Grammy Award, released multiple platinum albums, and was on the verge of crossing over into mainstream English-language pop music. She had opened boutiques, launched a clothing line, and inspired countless young Latinas who saw themselves reflected in her success. She was married to Chris Perez, her guitarist and the love of her life, and was planning for a future that seemed limitless. But on that March morning, all of those dreams would be shattered by a single gunshot. Yolanda Saldívar had entered Selena's life in 1991 as a devoted fan. She had impressed the Quintanilla family with her dedication and organizational skills, and Selena's father eventually appointed her president of Selena's fan club. The relationship grew, and Yolanda was eventually given more responsibility, including managing Selena's boutiques in Corpus Christi and San Antonio. For a time, everything seemed to function smoothly. But beneath the surface, something far more troubling was developing. By early 1995, employees at the boutiques began raising concerns. Money was disappearing. Fans who had sent checks to join the fan club were complaining they never received their membership packets. When family members started investigating, they discovered thousands of dollars were unaccounted for. Bank records revealed forged checks. Yolanda had been embezzling money, systematically stealing from both the fan club and the boutiques. When confronted with the evidence, she made excuses, claiming she had records that would prove her innocence, documents that she kept promising to produce but never did. Selena, despite the mounting evidence, wanted to believe the best in Yolanda. She had considered her a close friend, someone she had defended when family members first expressed suspicions. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the Quintanilla family made the decision to cut ties. They demanded financial records and informed Yolanda she was being removed from her positions. It was this confrontation that set in motion the events of March 31st. That morning, Selena agreed to meet Yolanda at the Days Inn motel in Corpus Christi. Yolanda had claimed she had been raped in Monterrey, Mexico, and needed Selena to take her to a hospital for examination. This story, like so many of Yolanda's claims, would later prove to be false. There had been no rape. It was a manipulation, a way to get Selena alone. After going to a hospital where doctors found no evidence of assault, the two women returned to the motel. Selena was there for one reason, to retrieve financial documents that Yolanda had promised for weeks to provide. Inside room 208, an argument erupted. Selena demanded the documents. Yolanda continued to stall, to make excuses. The conversation grew heated. Then, as Selena moved toward the door, preparing to leave, Yolanda pulled out a .38 caliber revolver she had purchased just 2 weeks earlier. She aimed and fired once. The bullet struck Selena in the right shoulder, severing a major artery. Selena ran from the room, her hand clutching her wound, blood already soaking through her clothing. She made it to the lobby, crying out for help, calling Yolanda's name, telling the desk clerk she had been shot. She managed to identify her attacker before collapsing. Staff called 911 immediately, and within minutes paramedics arrived. They rushed her to Corpus Christi Memorial Hospital, but the damage was catastrophic. The bullet had caused massive internal bleeding. Despite desperate attempts by medical staff to save her life, Selena Quintanilla-Pérez was pronounced dead at 1:05 in the afternoon. She was just 23 years old. Outside the motel, Yolanda Saldívar had barricaded herself inside her pickup truck in the parking lot. She held the gun to her own head, threatening suicide while police surrounded the vehicle. For nearly 10 hours, she engaged in a standoff with law enforcement, sometimes hysterical, sometimes calm, always insisting the shooting had been an accident. Negotiators worked carefully, knowing that one wrong move could result in another death. Finally, after hours of tense negotiation, Yolanda surrendered. She was taken into custody without further incident. The investigation that followed was straightforward in terms of physical evidence. Multiple witnesses had seen Selena run from the motel room. The desk clerk had heard her identify Yolanda as the shooter. Forensic evidence confirmed the gun belonged to Yolanda, and ballistics matched the bullet recovered from Selena's body to that weapon. Yolanda's own statements during the standoff, recorded by police, would prove damning. While she claimed the shooting was accidental, she had admitted to having the gun, to pointing it, to pulling the trigger. The motive was equally clear. Financial records subpoenaed by investigators revealed the full extent of Yolanda's embezzlement. She had stolen nearly $30,000 from the fan club and boutiques. She had forged checks and falsified documents. When confronted with irrefutable proof of her crimes, and faced with losing not only her positions but her connection to Selena, someone she had become obsessively attached to, Yolanda had made a choice. If she could not have control over Selena's life and career, she would take that life entirely. The trial began in October of 1995 in Houston. The venue had been changed from Corpus Christi due to intense publicity and the fear that an impartial jury could not be seated there. The prosecution presented a methodical case. They showed the jury the gun. They played recordings of Yolanda's standoff with police. They brought forward the financial records documenting her theft. They presented testimony from the desk clerk, from paramedics, from the doctors who had tried to save Selena. The medical examiner explained in clinical terms how the bullet had torn through Selena's body, how she had bled to death within minutes. Yolanda's defense team argued the shooting had been an accident, that Yolanda had been distraught and suicidal, that the gun had discharged when Selena tried to leave the room. They portrayed Yolanda as someone who loved Selena, who would never intentionally harm her. But the prosecution dismantled this narrative piece by piece. If it was an accident, why had Yolanda purchased the gun 2 weeks before? If she loved Selena, why had she stolen from her for years? If she was suicidal, why had she aimed at Selena instead of herself? The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On October 23, 1995, they returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. The evidence had been overwhelming. This was not an accident. This was not a crime of passion. This was murder, premeditated and deliberate. 2 days later, the jury sentenced Yolanda Saldívar to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Yolanda showed little emotion as the sentence was read. In interviews since, she has maintained her innocence, insisting still that the shooting was accidental. But the evidence tells a different story. The story of a woman consumed by obsession, who stole from someone who trusted her, and who, when finally exposed, chose to take a life rather than face the consequences of her actions. Yolanda Saldívar is now 64 years old. She remains incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She will be eligible for parole in 2025, 30 years after her conviction, but given the nature of her crime and its impact, parole seems unlikely. Selena's family has stated they will attend every parole hearing to ensure Yolanda remains behind bars. For them, no amount of time can compensate for the loss of a daughter, a sister, a wife, and an icon whose influence continues to inspire new generations. Number 2, the case of Genene Jones. Some criminals kill for money. Others kill for revenge or passion. But perhaps the most disturbing are those who kill for attention, for the twisted satisfaction of being seen as a hero even as they create the very tragedies they claim to solve. This describes Genene Jones, a pediatric nurse whose actions in the early 1980s resulted in the deaths of multiple infants and children, and whose full body count may never truly be known. Genene Jones was born in July of 1950 in San Antonio, Texas. She was adopted as an infant and grew up in a middle-class family. Those who knew her in her younger years described her as someone who craved attention and admiration. After high school, she pursued nursing, eventually specializing in pediatric care. By the late 1970s, she was working in the pediatric intensive care unit at Behar County Hospital in San Antonio, now known as University Hospital. It was there that a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Between 1977 and 1982, the pediatric ICU experienced an unusual number of infant deaths and near-death emergencies. Babies who had been stable would suddenly go into cardiac arrest or respiratory failure. The incident seemed to cluster around certain shifts, and staff began to notice something peculiar. Genene Jones was almost always present when these emergencies occurred. Moreover, she seemed to thrive during these crises. While other nurses panicked, Genene remained calm, taking charge, administering emergency medications, often being the one to save the child, if the child survived at all. Hospital administrators began an internal investigation in 1982 after a particularly suspicious cluster of deaths. They reviewed medical records and shift schedules. The correlation was undeniable. During shifts when Genene Jones was working, infant mortality rates were significantly higher. Estimates suggest as many as 60 infants may have died under suspicious circumstances during her tenure in the pediatric ICU, far exceeding normal statistical expectations for a unit of that size and patient population. The hospital, however, made a decision that would haunt them and cost more young lives. Rather than report their suspicions to law enforcement, they quietly forced Genene to resign in March of 1982. They gave no public explanation. They did not alert other medical facilities. They simply let her go. Within weeks, Genene Jones had found new employment. Dr. Kathleen Holland, a pediatrician, was opening a clinic in Kerrville, Texas, a small town about 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. She needed a nurse for her practice and hired Genene based on her experience and credentials. Dr. Holland had no idea what she was bringing into her clinic. The tragedy began almost immediately. Between August and September of 1982, multiple children treated at Dr. Holland's clinic experienced sudden and unexplained medical emergencies. Babies would come in for routine checkups or minor illnesses and would suddenly stop breathing or have seizures. Genene would spring into action, administering injections, often insisting the child needed to be rushed to the hospital. Dr. Holland, a capable and conscientious physician, was baffled. These were not sick children. There was no medical reason for these sudden crises. On September 17, 1982, 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan was brought to the clinic by her mother for a routine immunization and checkup. Chelsea was a healthy, happy toddler, the daughter of Petty and Reed McClellan. She had no significant medical history. The appointment should have been routine. Genene Jones administered the injections. Within minutes, Chelsea stopped breathing. Genene began emergency procedures, and the child was rushed to a hospital in San Antonio. Despite aggressive treatment, Chelsea and McClellan died that evening. The cause of death was initially listed as sudden infant death syndrome, but her mother refused to accept this. Chelsea had been perfectly healthy hours before. Something was terribly wrong. Just days later, another child, Rolando Santos, experienced a similar emergency at the clinic. The infant boy stopped breathing during a visit. He was rushed to the hospital and barely survived. His mother would later recall how Genene had seemed almost excited during the crisis, how she had moved with purpose and confidence while everyone else was terrified. The emergency room doctors who treated Rolando found something unusual in his blood, extremely high levels of a medication that should not have been there, a drug that could cause the exact symptoms he had experienced. Dr. Holland now had serious suspicions. She reviewed the medical supplies in her clinic and discovered that bottles of succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant used during surgeries and capable of causing respiratory paralysis, were missing. She also found that other medications, including heparin, a blood thinner, had been tampered with. Someone had been accessing these drugs, and the only person with opportunity was Genene Jones. Dr. Holland immediately fired Genene and reported her suspicions to authorities. The investigation expanded rapidly. Texas Rangers and local police obtained search warrants. They interviewed parents whose children had experienced emergencies at the clinic. They subpoenaed medical records from Behar County Hospital, where Genene had previously worked. They consulted with toxicologists and medical experts. What they uncovered was a pattern of deliberate harm spanning years and potentially dozens of victims. Forensic analysis of Chelsea McClellan's body revealed the presence of succinylcholine in her tissues. This drug would not have been administered during a routine checkup. Genene Jones had injected it into the child. The drug paralyzed Chelsea's breathing muscles, causing her to suffocate. Other children who had survived emergencies at the clinic also tested positive for drugs they should never have received. Investigators determined that Genene had been deliberately injecting children with dangerous medications to induce medical crises, then positioning herself as the hero who tried to save them. It was Munchausen syndrome by proxy taken to its most lethal extreme. The question became, why? Psychiatric evaluation suggested Genene craved the attention and validation that came from being seen as a skilled nurse during emergencies. She enjoyed the drama, the adrenaline, the praise she received when she saved a child. But that praise required there to be emergencies in the first place. So she created them. She played God with the lives of helpless infants, never considering that her actions were murder. In February of 1984, Genene Jones stood trial for the murder of Chelsea McClellan. The prosecution presented a devastating case. They showed the jury medical records documenting the impossible statistical clustering of emergencies around Genene. They presented expert testimony explaining how succinylcholine worked and how it had killed Chelsea. They brought forward grieving parents whose children had been harmed. The defense argued that the deaths were natural, that the prosecution was engaging in a witch hunt against a dedicated nurse. But the evidence was irrefutable. The jury convicted Genene Jones of murder on February 15, 1984. She was 33 years old. She was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Later that same year, she was tried and convicted for injuring Rolando Santos with a poisonous substance and received an additional 60 years, to be served concurrently. At the time, these sentences seemed to ensure she would never be free again. But Texas law in the 1980s included mandatory release guidelines based on prison overcrowding and good behavior credits. These guidelines meant that despite her 99-year sentence, Genene would accumulate enough credits to be released much sooner than expected. As the years passed and her potential release date approached, public outcry grew. Victims' families were horrified. How could someone who had murdered children, whose full victim count might reach into the dozens, be released? By 2017, Genene Jones was scheduled for mandatory release in March of 2018. But prosecutors in San Antonio were not going to let that happen. They reopened investigations into the deaths at Behar County Hospital from decades earlier. Medical records were re-examined. Families were re-interviewed. Patterns that had been suspected but never proven were now scrutinized with modern forensic techniques. In May of 2017, a grand jury indicted Genene Jones for the murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer, who died in December of 1981. Over the following months, additional indictments followed for the deaths of other infants, 2-month-old Rosemary Vega, 2-year-old Misty Reichenau, and others. These new charges prevented Genene's release. She remained in custody as prosecutors built their cases. The evidence, though decades old, was compelling. Medical records showed the same patterns seen in Kerrville, unexplained emergencies, deaths clustering around Genene's shifts, drugs found in victim systems that had no medical justification. By 2018, Genene Jones faced multiple murder indictments. Rather than face trial after trial, each one bringing more public attention to her crimes and more pain to victims' families, Genene Jones accepted a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to the murder of Joshua Sawyer. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to drop some of the other pending charges, and she received an additional life sentence. This plea ensured what the original sentence had failed to guarantee: she would never be released. She would die in prison. Genene Jones is now 74 years old. She is incarcerated at the Lane Murray Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She has never shown genuine remorse for her actions. In prison interviews and statements, she has continued to maintain her innocence despite her guilty plea, insisting she was railroaded by a system looking for a scapegoat. But the families of her victims know the truth. Chelsea McClellan would have been 43 years old today. Joshua Sawyer, Rosemary Vega, Misty Reichenau, and so many others never got the chance to grow up, to have families of their own, to live the lives that were stolen from them by a woman who saw them not as human beings but as props in her twisted need for attention and admiration. The true number of her victims may never be fully known, but her legacy of death and devastation is undeniable. Number 3, the case of David Temple ***. Sometimes the most dangerous place for a woman is in her own home, with someone who has vowed to love and protect her. This is the tragic reality that Belinda Temple discovered on January 11, 1999, when the husband she trusted took her life in a crime that would take nearly 2.5 decades to fully bring to justice. Belinda Lucas met David Temple in the late 1980s while both were students at Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches, Texas. David was a football player, charismatic and confident. Belinda was studying to be a teacher, warm and beloved by everyone who knew her. They fell in love, married in 1990, and built what appeared to be an ideal life together. By the mid-90s, they had settled in Katy, Texas, a suburb west of Houston. David had become a high school football coach at Hastings High School, where he was known for his intensity and his success on the field. Belinda taught at Katy High School, where students adored her gentle nature and genuine care for their success. In 1998, the Temples were expecting their second child. They already had a son, Evan, who was 3 years old, and Belinda was nearly 8 months pregnant with their daughter. To anyone looking from the outside, they seemed like the perfect American family. But beneath the surface, the marriage was fracturing. David Temple had been having an affair. Her name was Heather Scott, and she was a teacher at the same school where David coached. The affair had been ongoing for months, though David went to great lengths to hide it. He told Heather that his marriage was essentially over, that he and Belinda were staying together only for appearances. He promised Heather a future together. But Belinda was very much committed to her marriage and had no intention of leaving. She was focused on her pregnancy, on preparing for their daughter's arrival, on their family's future. She had no idea her husband was planning a different future entirely, one that did not include her. On January 11, 1999, David Temple called 911 from his home on Round Valley Drive in Katy. He told the dispatcher he had just returned home from shopping with his son and found his wife on the floor of their bedroom, covered in blood. When officers from the Harris County Sheriff's Office arrived, they found Belinda Temple lying face down in the couple's walk-in closet. She had been shot once in the back of the head with a 12-gauge shotgun at close range. The force of the blast had been catastrophic. Belinda, who was 30 years old and nearly 8 months pregnant, was dead. So was the daughter she was carrying, a child the couple had planned to name Aaron. David Temple's story seemed straightforward at first. He said he had taken Evan shopping that afternoon, leaving Belinda home alone. When they returned around 5:30 in the evening, he noticed the back door was open and realized the house had been burglarized. Electronics were missing, drawers had been rifled through. Then he went upstairs and found Belinda. He claimed he had tried to help her, though the nature of her injuries made survival impossible. He was hysterical, he said, overwhelmed with grief and shock. Investigators began processing the scene. The house did appear to have been burglarized. Items were indeed missing, and there were signs the back door had been forced open. But as detectives examined the evidence more carefully, inconsistencies began to emerge. The burglary seemed staged. Items that burglars typically take, like jewelry, were left untouched. The way drawers were opened and items scattered seemed performative rather than the result of a genuine search for valuables. And the timing was suspicious. Belinda had been killed during a very narrow window of time when she was home alone, a window that would have required specific knowledge of the family's schedule. Then there was the matter of the murder weapon. The shotgun used to kill Belinda had been fired from inside the closet, from very close range. There were no signs of a struggle. Belinda had been shot execution style in the back of the head. This did not fit the profile of a burglary gone wrong. Burglars do not typically shoot homeowners in closets. They flee when confronted. This murder was deliberate, planned, and personal. Investigators began looking more closely at David Temple. They learned about his affair with Heather Scott. They interviewed friends and family who revealed tensions in the marriage. They discovered David had recently increased Belinda's life insurance policy. They found that David had made statements to friends suggesting he felt trapped in his marriage, that he wanted out but saw no way to leave without losing everything: his son, his home, his reputation. And they learned something particularly damning: David Temple owned shotguns, and investigators believed one of them could have been the murder weapon. Forensic evidence began to mount. Investigators found that the crime scene had been carefully staged to look like a burglary. The pattern of the break-in, the items taken, the manner in which Belinda was killed, all pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of the home and the family's routine. But the most compelling evidence came from David's own behavior. In the weeks after Belinda's death, as he publicly grieved, he continued his relationship with Heather Scott. Within a short time, they were openly dating. Within 2 years, they were married. To investigators, this was not the behavior of a grieving widower. This was the behavior of a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted. Despite the evidence, the case moved slowly. David Temple was not immediately arrested. The investigation continued for nearly 8 years as prosecutors built their case methodically, ensuring every piece of evidence was solid, every witness credible, every forensic analysis defensible in court. Finally, in November of 2007, David Temple was arrested and charged with Belinda's murder. He was 40 years old. The trial began in 2007 in Harris County. The prosecution laid out a clear narrative: David Temple had murdered his pregnant wife to free himself to be with his mistress, staging a burglary to cover his tracks. They presented forensic evidence. They called Heather Scott to the stand, forcing her to testify about the affair. They brought forward friends who testified about David's complaints regarding his marriage. They showed the jury evidence of the staged burglary. And they presented testimony from investigators who explained how the physical evidence contradicted David's story of finding Belinda after returning home. The defense argued that David was being railroaded, that the investigation had focused on him from the beginning while ignoring other possibilities. They suggested the burglary was real, that an intruder had killed Belinda. They attacked the forensic evidence as inconclusive. But the jury did not believe them. On November 19, 2007, David Temple was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. However, the case did not end there. David Temple's attorneys filed appeals, arguing prosecutorial misconduct. They claimed the prosecution had withheld exculpatory evidence during the trial, evidence that might have pointed to other suspects. After years of legal battles, in 2016, an appeals court agreed. David's conviction was overturned. He was granted a new trial and released on bond after serving 9 years in prison. The families of Belinda Temple were devastated. It seemed justice had been undone. But prosecutors were determined. They prepared to retry David Temple, rebuilding their case with the benefit of lessons learned from the first trial. The second trial began in July of 2019. Once again, they presented the evidence. the affair with Heather Scott, the staged burglary, the forensic analysis, the timeline that made David the only person with means, motive, and opportunity. They brought forward new witnesses and refined their presentation. The defense presented the same core arguments, claiming David was innocent, that the real killer had never been found, that the prosecution was targeting him because they had no other suspects. On August 6, 2019, after deliberating for 14 hours, the jury reached a verdict, guilty of murder. David Temple was convicted a second time. But the legal saga was not over. The jury could not agree on sentencing. Under Texas law, if a jury cannot reach a unanimous decision on punishment, a mistrial is declared on the punishment phase alone, and a new jury must be seated solely to determine the sentence. This meant a third trial, this one focused only on what punishment David Temple should receive. That trial took place in April of 2023, more than 24 years after Belinda's murder. Prosecutors argued for the maximum sentence, emphasizing the brutality of the crime, the betrayal of trust, the murder of not just Belinda but her unborn child. They brought forward Belinda's family members who spoke about the devastation David had caused, the decades of pain they had endured, the justice they had fought so long to achieve. The defense asked for leniency, arguing David had already served 9 years and had a son who needed him. On April 12, 2023, the jury returned with their decision, life in prison. David Temple, now 56 years old, was finally sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars for the murder of his wife and unborn child. David Temple remains incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System. He has maintained his innocence throughout, claiming he is the victim of a flawed investigation and prosecutorial misconduct. His son Evan, who was just 3 years old when his mother was killed, has stood by his father, believing in his innocence. But Belinda's family, her parents and siblings, know the truth. They have fought for more than 2 decades to see justice done, attending every hearing, every trial, every appeal, never wavering in their determination to hold David accountable. Belinda Temple never got to meet her daughter Erin. She never got to watch Evan grow up, graduate, build his own life. She was stolen from this world at 30 years old, 8 months pregnant, by the man who had promised to love and cherish her. The journey to justice was long and painful, filled with setbacks and heartbreak. But in the end, the truth prevailed. David Temple will spend the rest of his life in prison, a consequence of the choice he made on that January day in 1999 when he decided his wife's life was worth less than his freedom. These individuals are serving life sentences in Texas prisons, removed from society so they can never harm again. Their crimes have left scars that span generations, families forever broken by loss, communities forever changed by tragedy. Justice in these cases was not always swift, and it was not always certain. Some took decades to achieve, requiring retrials, appeals, and the relentless determination of prosecutors and victims' families who refused to give up. But in the end, each of these killers faced accountability for their actions. They will spend their remaining days behind bars, a consequence of the choices they made and the lives they destroyed. As you reflect on these stories, we invite you to consider, what responsibilities do we have as a society to protect the vulnerable, whether they are elderly in care facilities, children in our communities, or those whose disappearances might otherwise go unnoticed? How can we ensure justice moves swiftly and certainly, so that families do not have to fight for decades to see accountability? Share your thoughts in the comments below.